Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Patty Skinkis, Viticulture Extension Specialist and Professor at Oregon State University. I'm pleased to be here with you this afternoon to talk about some of the practices we use in Oregon to produce premium grapes and wine from specifically Oregon's Willamette Valley. The Oregon wine grape industry has just under 40,000 planted vineyard acres. We have about 1,300 vineyards and almost 1,000 wineries. So if you do the math on the size of the Oregon industry, we have largely small acreage, small family farms and wineries that have to focus on quality production. The majority of our state's production is Pinot Noir, and that makes up 59% of the total state acreage. Pinot Noir, of course, is a cool climate variety, and the other two top varieties we produce are Pinot Gris and Chardonnay, also cool climate varieties. The amount of Pinot Noir has been increasing in acreage over the years. It's more than doubled since I have been in Oregon. Here are Oregon's wine regions. We have both cool climate and warm climate regions in the state and 21 AVAs, but the Willamette Valley is our largest AVA, shown there in black. It is where I'm located on main campus in Corvallis, Oregon, and I am closest to the largest percentage of the wine grape industry. We have 69% of the total acreage in the state and 80% of the total Pinot Noir acreage in the state. So I spend a lot of time working on research projects related specifically to Pinot Noir. Of course, it is a cool climate production region. Specifically, what does our cool climate look like? Well, we have about 2,100 heat units in a typical year. That's our long-term average. In the recent years, over the last 20, we've had increasingly warm seasons. We are now closer to about 2,500 heat units for the growing season. We get about 13 inches of rain during the season, so April to October or through October, but we have an annual precipitation of about 40 inches. Where we differ from Ohio's climate is that we tend to have pretty high annual rainfall, but we have pretty dry summers. So our July and August can be very dry, in some cases have no rainfall whatsoever, which makes it fantastic by comparison for disease and insect control. However, being that we have pretty high water holding capacity soils and fertile soils, we have a lot of vigor. So much like a lot of the eastern states and Midwest, we deal with managing vigor. So we have significant lateral growth, high canopy density, decreased sunlight infiltration into our canopies. Of course, the majority of our vineyards are on VSP systems and they're cane pruned. So a lot of our problems are related to having that canopy system, but also having relatively tight spacing. Over the years, it's changed from a wider spacing, maybe a 6 foot or 5 foot between vines in the row, but they've gone closer to about 4 or 3 feet between vines, which has exacerbated our problem with vigor. So can we fix this vigor? Well, certainly there's short-term fixes, and canopy management is really critical for this. Of course, we do a lot of shoot thinning and suckering. Hedging is critical. There's leaf removal that occurs throughout our season. So we have a lot of vineyards that look like this here on the right. Very well-maintained hedgerow systems. And this picture happened to be taken towards the end of the growing season, so it's very green throughout most of the season. But long-term, we really struggle with just the costs of canopy management and looking towards physiological change in the grapevine growth. So we have to look at vineyard floor practices. Most of our vineyards are dry farmed. They're not irrigated. Some other parts of our state tend to be irrigated more so. Fertility is another way we can control vigor to some extent, but most of the soils we're dealing with have pretty good nitrogen cycling during the growing season. So we really can't control physiological change directly through fertility and just turning on water or irrigating. So we have little control there. So what we've turned towards is vineyard floor management practices, and I'll talk about this a bit as we go through the presentation today. And I know that many of the projects being done in Cornell and Penn State date have been done with vineyard floor management practices to decrease vine vigor, and it works similarly here in Oregon. Of course, one of the things that a lot of growers are interested in is just thinking about the future and looking at replant decisions, seeing which training system might be better suited. It's really hard to break away from vertically shoot positioned canopies, and really most are looking at spacing and widening out the spacing to control vigor, but also maintain productivity on a per linear foot basis. So first, I'm going to start out by talking about managing the microclimate of these vigorous vines, so that short-term management option. And we all have to do this, I think, in premium wine grape production to ensure that we have the proper microclimate, not only for premium fruit quality, from a standpoint of the internal components of the fruit, the secondary metabolites or the basic ripening, but also from the standpoint of just simple disease management. So canopy management that occurs in Oregon, here's another snapshot of a vineyard that's been well maintained. You can see leaves have already been pulled on these vines. They've been hedged to a nice hedge box, almost perfect rectangle. You can see the leaves have been pulled there. And so there's a lot that goes into this in-season canopy management. Shoot thinning is really critical. We get more than one node, more than one shoot per node breaking each spring, and oftentimes there's going to be one or more passes for shoot thinning. Shoot positioning is also critical in our VSP canopies. Sucker removal at least once, if not more. We have hedging, that's absolutely vital, both tops and sides. Leaf removal, and of course, cluster thinning towards the end of the season. And when we add all of this up, this actually comes out to be a much bigger percentage of the total vineyard management budget, about 37% of the annual budget. That's even more so than our pesticide costs or pesticide application costs. Of course, that's also high in vineyards in Oregon. So I'm going to start out with the key things and timings of what growers do here. Shoot thinning is an absolute necessity. Like I mentioned before, we usually have 2 to 3 shoots coming out from each node, even on cane prune vines. We try to reach a density of 3 to 4 shoots per foot instead of 3 to 6 shoots per foot. And that's largely due to being on cane prune vines. The benefit is really to get this done at a critical time before shoots have elongated too far. This is so we have good airflow and also increased sunlight exposure. With oftentimes our springs having low light intensity, we deal a lot with potentially having low fruitfulness into the following year, and the buds are being born in the current season for next season's fruitfulness. Also, you have to think about shoot thinning practices. A lot of our growers are currently cane pruned, and shoot thinning is a little bit less laborious or needs fewer passes than in spur pruned vineyards because they don't have as many adventitious shoots growing on the cane itself. It's mainly on the trunk. So growers who have converted, I'll talk about this in my next presentation tomorrow on cane versus spur pruning, but that's one of the considerations as growers move forward to potentially considering a pruning change. Hedging, absolutely necessary in most of our vineyards. Many are doing hedging at least 2 times, if not 2 to 3 or 4 times. Here's an example of a vineyard that is planted actually by a California group. We have this happen quite frequently, that we have California producers come, purchase land or develop land for a buyer, and they use the California system. And if you look closely at this vineyard, you can see that it's probably not quite spaced far enough apart between the vine rows. And until it's hedged, it really doesn't actually meet the 1-to-1 ratio. So before it's hedged, or even the hedge height is still taller than the distance between the vine rows. So what we see in this vineyard in particular is significant shading through most of the day onto either portions of the canopy or the cluster zone itself. So in these situations, we really need to make sure that hedging is done at a tighter range above the line posts, and or using a different, trying to just plan ahead and use a different spacing. And I should mention all of our hedging is usually at the top and the sides, especially in a high density vineyard. Leaf removal. Now, this is where we see a lot of variation at times as to when growers will use leaf removal. And I know there's been many studies done, both in the East and the West, with respect to leaf removal on different climates, different cultivars. And in Oregon, we've done a number of leaf removal trials. When I first came to Oregon 15 years ago, the growers were all over the board with respect to when they were leaf pulling. Mostly, they were doing it in a cluster zone, and they were doing it only a little bit very late in the season, mostly post-veraison. So we did a number of studies over the years and came up with these best management practices, basically removing leaves in the cluster zone. They can be in the east side of north-south rows, excuse me, and they may remove as many as 50 to 100% of those cluster zone leaves. This is best applied in high vigor or high density canopies where they really need to avoid shading of the clusters or the buds on the canes. And we recommend that they do it pretty early in the season, not waiting too late, so bloom to fruit set. And this is in part due to disease management tactics, both for powdery mildew and botrytis, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We do not recommend doing any leaf pulling past the pea size or bunch closure stage, and certainly not to do any leafing post-veraison, in part because we get some of our highest heat during the early part of August when we're just starting veraison, and that was traditionally when growers wanted to start doing their leafing, and typically that would lead to sunburn. But some of our results came from doing a number of trials over the years, both a timing and an intensity trial. Our first trial was done using 100% of cluster zone leaf removal at 5 different time points, or I should say 4 different time points, and having a no pull control. This was done in commercial vineyards, and the concern at the time when I started this work was that growers thought they could not leaf pull early on at pre-bloom stages or even bloom stages because the leaves were critical for carbohydrate development or assimilation for the developing cluster. Well, we wanted to be able to at least see what our range of possibility was. So we started the work at pre-bloom, thinking that it might have an impact on early season powdery mildew sprays in particular. So we did 100% cluster zone leaf removal at pre-bloom, bloom, BB to pea size stage, or bunch closure, and compared that to no leaf pulling at all. And what we found in doing this work was very interesting. This was done in 2 commercial vineyards over a number of years, and both of these commercial vineyards were using an organic spray program, in which case they did not have a really effective botryticide to use on the clusters. And so we were really interested in how leafing would help with botrytis control. This basically showed that if you did not pull leaves, there was a much higher percentage of botrytis severity at harvest in both of the vineyards. If you leaf pulled pre-bloom all the way to bunch closure, you pretty much got the same response in terms of the amount of botrytis that would develop. During this time, growers had an active powdery mildew spray program and were doing the best they could to control disease. And what I show here is in particular a wetter, cooler year where we had much more botrytis than in a typical year. So even though they did have higher botrytis, we can see the percentage is quite low, so 20% or less depending on the vineyard. But leafing really did have a major impact on reducing botrytis. The other benefit of early season leafing was that we found that doing 100% cluster zone leaf removal, we had an increase in anthocyanin compared to the no leaf removal when we did it at the bloom stage in particular. So going in early and doing this, we found that in both the early site and the late site. So the sites were about 2 weeks apart for harvest and for most bud break and phenology throughout the season. So we saw that impact was pretty uniform across the 2 sites. So definitely a benefit to increasing anthocyanin, which many times our Pinot Noir wines are quite low, and especially in cool seasons. So we saw that 100% cluster zone leaf removal was beneficial. It didn't cause sunburn, didn't cause a lot of damage, but a lot of growers were nervous about that much leaf removal. So we decided to look at variations of intensity. So we took between 0% leaf removal in the cluster zone and 100%, and also 50%. So literally removing half of the leaves every other node during the pea-size stage of berry development, and we included an industry standard, which was removing leaves on the east side only. When we did this work, we did not see any differences in basic ripeness of the berries, but what we saw was that we had an increase in beta-damascenone. And beta-damascenone for Pinot Noir is an important aroma compound that is a blackberry, so the dark fruit aromas. And we increased beta-damascenone by having an increased light. So down here on the x-axis is increased light exposure, and on the y-axis is increased beta-damascenone. And we saw that was much more increased in our cooler year, which was 2010, and in the vineyard that was had much higher density. So this is the cooler year, more high vigor vineyard, where the benefit of leaf removing was seen more than in the vineyard that had less vigor, and in the overall less vigor in this vineyard where there was not as much of an impact on overall concentrations. So there is a benefit to leaf removal. And for the Oregon industry, we've really used this data to help guide them in how they do their leaf removal. In some seasons out here, because we are so dry, growers are concerned about sunburn. And we're really trying to get them to do their leaf removal much earlier, and the berries will acclimate during that time. 100% leaf removal in particular is really beneficial for anthocyanin and wine color intensity. It does not lead to sunburn. I have a picture here from 2018, which is a recent hot year, a dry year that we had. And this is an example of 100% cluster zone leaf removal at bloom. And the fruit looks gorgeous. We have seen increased aroma compounds with more leaf removal. There's minimal impact on fruit set or yields. We do see some reduction in fruit set by about 20% when we do leafing this early, but by the time we get to harvest, the yields aren't any different. And I attribute that to the fact that growers are already doing some sort of crop management. And so it's not enough of a reduction to see a major reduction in their target yields. This is really an important tool for disease prevention. We have a lot of vineyards that are organic or biodynamic, and they want to be able to use minimal chemicals during the late season, or they just don't have good chemicals that are good at botrytis control. So leafing is absolutely critical. Many growers, although leafing is easily mechanized, many of our growers actually still do it by hand. And part of the reason for this is because they have a crew and they want to keep them around and busy rather than to lose them to other crops in the region. So much to my surprise, I would say about 50% of the acreage is mechanized leafing, while 50% is manual. But I think that will be changing with new labor regulations and lack of availability. So next, I want to move on to how we manage vigor. And I mentioned before, many of our vineyards are dry farmed. We do have a good amount of water holding capacity, and early season, we have a lot of really rapid shoot growth. And that's really probably going off of carbohydrate reserves from prior year, but also just the really, the high soil moisture, high nitrogen cycling that we have in the soil. And so we grow a lot of vigor, especially early in the season. So vineyard floor management has been our best friend. I did some studies for over a 9-year period when I first came to Oregon to look at how we can best use vineyard floor management to control or balance vegetative vigor. And the hypothesis was that we could use grass cover in a no-till system to reduce vine growth through competition for either soil moisture or possibly nitrogen compared to the tilled and the alternate till. So all three were very common practices used by growers, and they either would leave a grass cover in, which is very typical in many grape growing regions, or they would do alternate row tillage, always leaving a permanent alternate, and then or just doing a complete tillage. We always had under vine weed control, either mechanical or herbicide. So in this study in particular was done in a commercial vineyard in the North Willamette Valley. The grower had planted perennial red fescue 3 or 4 years before we started the trial. And we just simply looked at doing alternate tilled with grass or perennial grass cover. Our tilled always had a winter annual cover crop sown in, usually something that was a cereal grain. We rototilled in spring, and we typically, although in this picture shows weeds under vine, when this picture was taken, they hadn't controlled for them yet, but basically we always had under vine weed control, either tillage or herbicide, or a combination. And what we found from this study in years 1 through 4, we did see a reduction in our canopy leaf area. So leaf area at veraison was decreased by years 3 and 4. So it didn't happen right away in the leaf area by using no-till or the grass. So no-till had reduced pruning weights first by year 2, reduced shoot lengths early season by years 3 and 4, reduced leaf area by 3 and 4, and reduced yield by year 4. Most of this was really due to tissue nitrogen. We saw that start to decline by year 3. The canopy growth was affected before yield was affected, and we always were able to reach target yield. So the yield reduction was never a concern. Basically, it would help them with reducing crop thinning passes. So here's an example of how devigorating this was. This is the grass treatment, the no-till in July. And this is pretty healthy canopy. If we look down the row here, so this is the grass treatment. Look down the row, we can see there's the tilled treatment right here, and it's a bit darker, less sunflex coming through. So I took this picture in the morning to try to be able to show sunflex. Here's the tilled, less sunflex coming through compared to the grass over here. If you look at the sunflex, you can actually see some of that. And growth effects were continued into years 5 through 7. And the tilled versus no-till, we see that at bloom, we had 19 to 39% lower leaf area in the no-till. And by veraison, we had 21 to 45% lower leaf area. So really reducing that canopy size early helps with sunlight infiltration and overall balance of the canopy. By year 9, this is an example of what the vines looked like. They're still nice and green at the end of the season. This is towards bunch closure. The tilled is in the background there. The foreground is grass. And what I want to point out is the top of the canopy. What we actually saw was that the grass was devigorated enough to not really fill that hedge box, but the tilled vines continued to fill the hedge box and actually needed to be hedged. So if they weren't in the same vineyard, you would be able to say that you could reduce your number of hedging passes. There's reduced laterals in grass or the no-till. And so we were seeing that continuous effect. But how and why were these impacts taking place? Well, we looked at soil moisture under vine as well as plant water stress throughout all of the growing seasons. And what we found was there was really no difference in soil volumetric water content during the growing seasons between these treatments. We also did not see a difference in how the vines were responding to potential water stress, and that's no surprise because the soil moisture was about the same. So there was no difference in plant stem water potential. What we found was the biggest effect was in vine nitrogen status. We started seeing the impact show up in year 3. So it wasn't immediate, wasn't right away. It was also noticed in both the bloom time petioles and the veraison leaf blades. And we can see in this plot that the grass vines, the no-till, were always lower than the alternate or the tilled. So it stands to reason that it was likely that the tillage helped cycle some nitrogen from nitrification of the breakdown of the plant material compared to the grass, which was utilizing nitrogen from the soil or competing with the vines. I do want to point out this is the deficiency level or the break point for sufficiency. So we normally were above that except for one season in 2012. Now, this did follow through into the fruit, so we did see an impact on the yeast assimilable nitrogen in the fruit. We see that the grass treatment, the no-till, had the lowest YANs compared to the alternate and the tilled. And it's really interesting that the tilled was the highest and the alternate till was right in the middle. So vineyard floor management affected YAN by year 2 onward. And even though the YAN levels were getting low, so below that 140 mark, 140 milligrams per liter with the dashed line there were no stuck fermentations when below optimum when we made wines from these studies. So in summary, from doing this work, a lot of the growers looked at this work as really being pivotal to helping them manage their vine vigor. The trials were used by a lot of vineyard managers to adjust how they do their tillage, whether they do alternate or no-till, based on the inherent vine vigor, whether it was their soil type or the slope and other aspects such as depth of their soil. But it really helped them realize that vineyard floor management can help alter vine vigor. When I first started this work, a lot of their concern was whether it impacted fruit and wine quality. It wasn't towards looking at vigor management. But what I helped them realize is that it's a way for us to effectively adjust either soil moisture or vine nutrient status. Although in the seasons that I did the research, we had sufficient soil moisture for growth. Although one could argue that perhaps the adjustment of soil moisture or differences and lack of differences could also be due to changes in the vine's capacity for rooting as a result of their upper canopy growth. But basically, we had proof that the treatments were impacting vine nitrogen status. So the grass or the no-till was decreasing nitrogen availability in the soil, while the tillage was increasing nitrogen availability by cycling nitrogen in from the vegetation that was being tilled into the vineyard. The no-till, we found that we had smaller vines that could have decreased the water demand later in the season. We also found low fruit YAN. And while that was concerning to many growers, or to winemakers, I should say, they actually found improved wine color and aroma that was considered to be a better trade-off than just having a vineyard-produced YAN. I should mention that most of our growers most of our winemakers would rather see YANs produced in the vineyard rather than adding DAP into the winery. So that is always a consideration for us when we're doing vineyard floor management studies. So this study really helps growers understand the impact of reduced tillage or no-till, but they might have taken it a little far. In recent years, with the regenerative agriculture movement, many growers are interested, or wineries are interested in doing very little tillage. And we do see a bit of extended faith in using the grass system and basically leading to some competition. So the no-till can weaken vines over time in our climate. We've been able to do that in different vineyards. It depends on soil depth, soil type, and vine age as well, and how much of the vineyard floor is still covered with grasses. We find that under vine, it's still beneficial to leave that clean of weeds, whether it's through in-row tillage or through herbicide. But basically, the closer you get with those grasses, it does seem to weaken the vine over time, which could be a benefit in some cases. But the most common vineyard floor management practice at this time still is the alternate tillage with perennial grass cover, because it does allow for that the best of both worlds for the grapevine, but also the workers being able to have some traction through our vineyards. We get a lot of rainfall in winter, and we still do need some cover in there. And even throughout the growing season, having some cover in the vineyard is helpful for tractor and people traffic. So next, I want to talk about yield management, and I'm going to wrap up with this because this is a big part of what Oregon growers have focused on over time. Really, the question is, does controlling yield control quality? Many grape growers in the state have controlled yield for a long time through cluster thinning. This is the yield data from the state from 1990 through 2020. And what we see is that over this time span, we have a relatively narrow range of yields between 1.5 tons per acre to 3 tons per acre. And most of the time throughout this period, we have between 2 and 2.5 tons per acre. That is the standard yield target for a long time. From 1990 to 2020, a lot of things have changed in vineyard management. We have more vines per acre, we have, which should increase tons per acre, but we don't see that happening. And it was in 2012, I began doing a large grower field trial that engaged growers in yield management. Now, prior to 2012, I had done some other replicated crop thinning trials to show that there is very little impact of yield reduction on increasing fruit quality. But it really required getting more growers involved. And what we see is after we started that work, we see an increase in yield reported at the state level by about 25%. So we have an increase from what used to be about 2.2 tons per acre up to 2.6 tons per acre as of 2012 or from 2012 onward. And part of this was due to the engagement of the industry in a very large crop load trial over a 10-year period. This included 10 to 15 vineyards annually, and they were directly involved in the research. 14 of them were in the study for 3 or more years, and 5 were in the study for 10 years. We had a total of 25 companies involved with 28 vineyards and 5 counties and 6 AVAs. And from this research, I wanted to show you some results of the work. We cluster thinned at different number of clusters per shoot, and we compared this to a no thinning treatment. The no thinning treatment, you can see here's the distribution of the yields on a pounds per linear foot basis. Now I reported in this unit because we have different vine densities and vines per acre. So rather than tons per acre, it's important to show yields in pounds per linear foot. And based on the year, we had anywhere from 0.7 to 1.8 pounds per linear foot as our no thin treatment. So that's our natural yield, baseline yields. And when we crop thin to these different levels, we were reducing reducing yields by 8, 22, 42, or 64%. To give you an idea of the magnitude of treatments of reduction for vineyards, most vineyard collaborators did a 2 cluster per shoot and a 1 cluster per shoot treatment. So you have a pretty big span in the amount of yield from these vineyards. This crop thinning was always done at lag phase. And this is a figure that summarizes at least most of the years of the research. And what it's showing is the number of vineyards that had a difference with cluster thinning for these key parameters for fruit composition or fruit quality. And what we find is that of basically 10 to 14 sites per year, we usually have very few, if you look at the total number of vineyards, having an impact with total soluble solids, pH, titratable acidity. We basically saw that 55 to 85% of the sites in any given year had something different with cluster thinning. Each year we had some vineyards between 15 to 45% that had absolutely no difference in their fruit composition with cluster thinning, and only 14 to 38% had some aspect of primary ripeness, so Brix, pH, or TA, that was impacted by cluster thinning. But the key things that were impacted were Brix and anthocyanins. But again, it was not every vineyard, not every year, and it was very inconsistent. So that was our biggest finding, no consistencies by crop level or vintage year. But when we took all the first 5 years of data, and we're in the process of doing this with all 10 years of data, we looked at it from a lot of different statistical procedures, but taking all of the vineyard sites, all of those first 5 years, what we found was that for every pound per linear foot we decrease in yield, we increase by 0.6 Brix. Now, if we convert that to something that means something to a grower, and we convert it to a vineyard with 8-foot rows, that means that for every 2.7 tons we drop on the ground, there would be an increase of 0.6 Brix. But when I shared this with growers based on our statistical models, they said, we don't even produce 2.7 tons per acre. we rarely have a pound per linear foot. So in those years where we do have a pound per linear foot and we reduce, or we're having a pound per linear foot or more, and we reduce the crop level, we can see a Brix increase, but 0.6 is not enough. And so it became one of those situations where it certainly is a finding from the research regressions, but it's not a practical finding. Essentially, there was no impact of cluster thinning in most vineyards. The other thing we noticed was when we look at crop load, which is looking at yield to pruning weight, we find that with cluster thinning, even without cluster thinning, we had what is considered optimum for Oregon, which is 3 to 6 without doing any cluster thinning. So if we cluster thinned, we just got lower crop loads, which doesn't necessarily increase our fruit quality. So basically, we aren't overcropping our vines, and doing any cluster thinning is not really necessary. In 2018, the purple line there, we had the highest crop load, yet the fewest differences in fruit composition in that year. This is likely due to 2018 being a warm year for us, and the vines were not overcropped and did just fine. So crop load for Oregon producers is relatively meaningless because we are not overproducing at levels that are above optimum. In fact, the only vineyards that are not producing optimum are vineyards that are really weak. So the project results, we basically found that the vineyard effect with increasing yield, we found no decline in vine health. There were a few differences in fruit composition. They were not consistent. The biggest differences were the site. So a site really dictated the quality of the fruit or the wine. When we did wine sensory, that followed through. We saw very little impact of yield on aroma, color, or mouthfeel. And as a result of doing this work and everybody from the industry being involved, we see a statewide impact on increasing yield targets by about 25%, which is pretty significant for growers and wineries. And the bigger effect is that many producers are seeing much more leniency and willingness to talk to vineyard managers about what the range can be for optimum wine quality. So as a summary to what we do here in Oregon, and I think this is very similar in many premium wine growing regions, is that there's significant seasonal inputs into canopy management to make high vigor vineyards suitable or have the right canopy microclimate for premium wine production. Vigor management really ought to be a primary focus in these regions to just try to balance the canopy, not only from a physiological standpoint, but also to help reduce those canopy management costs. Yield management is definitely less impactful than managing the vigor. We found that in one study in particular that we looked at canopy vigor management through vineyard floor management and crop load. And it was really hands down the vineyard floor management that played a role in the fruit and wine quality. Vineyard site and year are important to consider. What works in some vineyards won't always work in another. And that's the hardest part about doing research that I can apply to everybody, is just encouraging growers to get out there and try different things in your vineyard and just keep up with what's going on in the literature and who's doing what across the US and what works for grape growing. And keep in mind that grapevines are perennials, and what you do has a long-term impact. And so we're not growing corn or broccoli. We have to consider what's been happening the past years, and we really need to take that into consideration. So I want to thank you, and I hopefully have some questions that I can address.